Okay,
Hey, so are we moving on to the next thing, or do you have like 50 different other
I
things?
was reading the application yesterday afternoon and I found 100
Oh,
more things that I want to do.
that sounds tiring.
Yeah, well, the first one is good news.
Okay.
Remember that bug we had in Postman? Sometimes
Yep.
some tests were failing.
Yeah.
Well, it's a problem that only happens on camera. Weird, right?
Why?
Because when I'm recording, I am running the thing that is recording my screen, which makes my computer do more
Slower.
work.
Okay.
And when it does more work, it has a better chance of running into the problem.
I don't understand.
Yeah, it seems like it's not occurring right now because it only happens some of the time, right? And it only happens when I'm doing a lot on the computer, when the computer is slow.
Okay.
It took me a while to figure out. I had to reproduce the problem by trying to make my computer slower, and then I looked at the console. Eventually, I found out what the problem was.
What is how? Okay. How can anything that affects your computer make this a problem for
Yeah, so
Postman?
here's what I noticed. When I was looking at the logs for in the console right here, I can see the logs of the requests, right?
Yep.
I was looking at the logs for the requests that run on the put,
Yep.
the edit item request. And I noticed that it was not trying to update the latest item identifier. So in the pre-request script, we
Oh, you
create.
should get the item identifier and try to update it, right?
I have no idea what you just said.
So whatever item identifier you get from your pre-request script, that is what you're supposed to update using the
Yes.
put request, and that is how the test will pass.
Yes.
You're saying that it is trying to update something else entirely.
Yes. The item identifier was not the latest item, but the previous one. The one right before it. Here is the problem. In this
Didn't set the
pre-request,
environment variable, did it?
no, the environment variable is set right here.
Then
Hang on. We made like a whole episode or maybe half an episode about race conditions.
yeah.
The problem here is a race condition. The problem is that in this pre-request script, we create an item
Okay.
and then we get all the items and fetch the last.
Yes.
The problem is that this request runs and this request runs. It doesn't wait for the first one to finish before it starts. So
Okay.
if this request returns first and this request returns second, then
yeah.
this last item will be the second to last.
Yeah, previous identifier.
Yes, that is the problem. It's a race condition here on the client. Well, we know how to fix race conditions on the server, and that was a whole different business. Here on the client, the problem is I only want this request to start after this one has finished.
Yep.
So here, if I were in the browser, I would be using async await. We saw that in the browser, but here I'm in Postman, so I have to use the PM send request thing, which does not support, as far as I can tell,
Asynchronous requests. Okay.
Yes. So, but it does support this, right? We can have a function that only runs when the request is over.
Okay.
So we can have a function here that will only run when the request is over. And in this function, we do the thing we were doing before, like so.
So we're nesting this here.
And now this request will create the item, and this request will only try to fetch items
Once it is done,
after the creation has succeeded. And then this environment variable is guaranteed to be the last in the database. The same thing happens in...
that's what I was going to ask. We do something very similar in delete.
Yeah, the same problem because we copy and paste it. So same solution. And now we can save this, and this gets rid of that problem. Unfortunately, it's hard to show the solution here on camera because it's hard to reproduce. It's hard to reproduce, so it's hard to show that the thing is now not going to run into the problem again. But I can run just a couple of times to see if it will run into that problem. I know for a fact it won't because I tried it several times. But that's the thing. It's interesting, right? Because when my computer is recording and it's doing a lot of things and running the server and whatnot, then my computer becomes slower, which makes the server slower, which makes the first request sometimes take longer, and then the second request was being faster.
All right.
So when my computer is not recording, the bug is harder to reproduce. And unfortunately, now it was recording and it didn't run into the problem anytime. But yeah, now we fixed it.
We're good now, yeah. Okay.
So I will export this and we'll be good to go into the next item in our refactoring to-do list. fix
Postman
test.
Race condition. Okay.
Yeah. Now coming back to what we were talking about in the previous episode.
Yeah.
Oops, I just closed the thing that I wanted to work on. So what we did on the last episode is we broke apart the application into its many components.
Yeah.
And now we have some components that are functions, some components that
are classes,
that are classes, implementing the render method. But they are all the components are still defined within within the get data from server function.
Yep. Yeah.
Not what we want, right? We want to separate these concerns.
Yes.
Our ultimate goal here is to don't remount the application every time. Yep. So that's our ultimate goal. But first we have to be able to extract this from within this function. We want to pull this out of this function.
Yep.
I have an item here that is easy to fix. The key that we have. Remember the key from many episodes ago? We have the key. Where is it?
That's a list key.
All right. Yeah. So the key here has the purpose of telling React, this is this item. It identifies this item. And I believe that React may be complaining again in the console. Yeah, it's complaining again in the console saying that each child of a list should have a unique key property, but the key property is right there. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is that the key should not be in the list item right here.
It should be in the class.
The key should not be in the list item right here. The key should be when we are calling the component in the loop, like so.
I don't think that was there.
So when you have a loop rendering components, you have to call the key right there so that the key is not attached necessarily to the list item, to the tag in HTML. The key is attached to the component. Okay. Previously, we didn't have components here, so when we extracted the component, we needed to fix this as well. And it appears that we don't want this props item identifier. We just want to say item identifier right here. So now let's rerun the server, refresh the browser, and see if that warning goes away. It goes away. So that was the problem with the key. I figured out this one when I was reading the application yesterday. And now let's go to the don't remount the application every time. So I'll just commit this small fix. So fix key. Now, to be able to extract all the components from within the get data from server, we need to be aware of what
all the dependencies there are. How data flow is working, basically, right?
Yeah, we need to be aware of how data flows within this function. So response, the first variable, the first piece of data. Now that's easy. It's only used here to get data from server. In fact, we could as well inline this.
And
like so. I kind of like this better because it's fetching and getting the JSON all in one line. How do you feel about this?
I'm fine with it, but just like I'm not used to seeing multiple awaits in the same line.
Yeah, but it's something you can do.
Yeah.
Just to show that async await doesn't necessarily make your code bloat.
Yep.
You don't have to extract variables for all the intermediate steps. So yeah, now let's look at the data from server, right? Because starting from here,
does that go?
Starting from here up to here, we are always defining components, right? That's all definitions of components. So let's look at data from server, and let's see where it's used. Well, IntelliJ is highlighting. IntelliJ is highlighting where data from server is being used. So of course we can use the data from server here because it's available from within the function. But if we want to extract,
remove this, then you need a way to access that variable outside of the function as well.
Yes. So if we want to extract this component and get it out of the get data from server function, we need to get this data from server in the item list somehow. Well, we kind of already know the technique. Yeah, we kind of already know the technique. We can use props. Props are like arguments that are passed into the component. And we can pass these arguments throughout the component structure. So let's start from the top. In fact, I may even reorder this so that
application comes first.
Yeah, so that it starts from the top. So now application is the first thing, and I can reorder these things in any way I want, right? Because they are all just definitions of components. The mounting of the component happens later.
Yep.
So I can reorder these definitions however I want. So I'll start with the application, and then in the application we have a plus button and a header and an item list. So I'll put the components in that order. So the plus button is...
That's it, yeah, it's a function.
It is here. And then we have the header.
That is fine.
And then the item list. This isn't like essential, it's just for us readers to make sense of things in the order they appear. So within the item, we have the mark item is done and the item description, which is already...
That's the order you follow.
Yeah, it's already occurring in that order. So now let's trace the data flow through the application. Well, the data from server, it needs to start flowing through the application itself.
Yep.
So when we are calling the application here, when we are mounting the application, we can pass in the items, right?
Yep. This dot props dot.
And this is what we do. We fetch the items, the data from server thing. It's just fetching the items. So I can even copy this code right here. I inlined that variable and got rid of that variable.
Line itself.
Yeah. So now the items are props that we can use in the application.
Yes. Anywhere in the application.
Yeah. So now we have the application has props with items.
Yeah.
The plus button doesn't really need the items.
The
header doesn't need the items, but the item list does need. So I can say items
equal this dot props
dot items. Yeah. And then let's go to the plus button doesn't need items. The header doesn't need items. The item list.
This is where you want.
Now it's no longer called data from server. So it's this
dot props dot items. Yes.
And the rest of the application was already using the props.
Particularly,
with the particular items. So I believe that this...
That should do, actually.
I believe this will work. I haven't tried it before. It does work.
It looks like it.
Yeah.
Still can't change anything.
Yeah, we cannot change anything. When we try to change something, it immediately re-renders the whole application. We can see here in the console that the elements are being re-rendered
still flashing
every 200 milliseconds, and I don't have a chance to really type. We'll fix that real soon. But now we have a way to trace the data flow through the application. It starts from the top and flows down. All right, so let's just commit this as well. So flow items as props.
Yeah. I was going to say reverse dependency injection, but...
Now we can very easily just get all the definitions of components from outside the get data from server, because none of them depend on any variables here. In fact, we don't even have any variables any longer, right? So now we can pull out all the definitions from all the component definitions from within the get data from server. It's now a separate thing. All right. So let's see if this works. I think it should. All the same. Perfect.
Now about mounting.
Yeah, so I guess now we are in a good position to talk about. Maybe I should commit this? No, I don't think so.
No, it's fine. You just literally just kind of refactored.
Yeah, so now the next step is we want to get rid of this mounting of the application every 200 milliseconds. Yeah. The way to do this is we need to learn something else about React. Currently, the only thing we know about React is how to define components and how to work with props.
Yep.
Props are passed into the component.
Classes.
So if you want to think of the component as a function, props are arguments.
And for your classes, they're just properties.
They are just properties, but they're still passed to the object, to the component, by whoever is creating that object. So here in the item list, we are passing the props in.
Yes.
The items is part of the props. So we are passing in. But there is another thing in components in React, that is state. So state is different from props in that they are not passed into the component.
Okay. So is state like a global thing?
No, it's contained in the component. So if you want to think about components as objects in Java, for instance,
Okay.
the state is the instance variables.
Okay, so basically, for each type of component, you can have a different state, rather than having like a snapshot of the entire application
Yeah.
itself.
Not only for each kind of component, but for each instantiation of the component.
Yeah,
So
okay.
if we wanted to have plus button with state,
Yeah.
we don't. But if we wanted, this plus button could have a different state from
Then
this
the
one.
second one, okay, yeah.
So now we need to learn about how to use state. And luckily, the second example in the React web page, the React home, right here, it starts with a simple component that doesn't have state. It only uses props.
Yeah.
But then the second example already uses state.
Yep.
So now the internal state of the component can be managed by using this whole shenanigans that we are about to see. So first, where do we even want to hold this state?
Items, I think each item should have a different state, or item list, one of the two.
Yeah, I would like to see that in the item list as opposed to in the items, because we are getting data from the server in form of a list.
Yeah, it goes to item list, not to item itself.
Yeah, we could also, so remember that the application is rendering the item list. So we could also have the state in the application. We can always pull the state upwards in the component hierarchy.
Yeah.
But I think that having it in the item list will work just fine.
Yeah.
So now, yeah, you know what? I'm going to commit this because I don't want the two changes to overlap. So I just pulled components out. And let's go to the item list. And now item list will become a stateful component.
Yep.
So first, we need to have this constructor. So
wait, does that really say constructor? Is that the keyword?
It's not a keyword. It's just the name of a method that will be called when this component, or in JavaScript, this object is created. Okay. So you know how in Java you have a constructor just being the name of the class?
Yeah, that's what that's why I was asking.
Yeah, so in Java, constructor is like this. It's the name of the class.
Yep.
In JavaScript,
it's constructor.
It's called constructor. And we have to be explicit and say, call the parent, in this case, this is the parent. Call the parent with the props. Now we are starting to see how the React components work from within.
Yep.
So we didn't have an explicit constructor before, so it was inheriting the constructor from the React component, which was putting the props in place for us to use.
Yeah.
Now we have to be explicit and call the super. And then we can say what the state is. Initially, the state may be like empty, maybe an empty list, because that's how we have the items, right? We have them as lists. This JSON will return a list. We see that in Postman, literally here, it is a list. Yeah. So we can start with an empty list, like so.
Yeah.
And then we want to do some things when the component mounts the first time around.
Okay.
So
okay. So it will work as, it will basically have some method that says that it is ready to mount, then it will mount, then when it is doing everything, it's fine, and at the end, it will be ready to unmount and then actually unmount.
Yeah, so the same way that the server, remember how Javalin server had a life cycle?
Yes, exactly.
Event, server
starting, server started, server stopping, server stopped, exactly.
Yeah, we saw that many episodes ago. Yeah. We even used one of the events to close the connection to the database. When the server stopped. We close the connection.
Yep.
Well, components in React have a similar life cycle.
Okay.
And the component starts by being mounted. That's what we do when we say render.
Application render, yeah.
And then when it mounts, it calls a bunch of methods if you define them. And when it will unmount, it also calls a bunch of methods if you define them. So the reason why we are using class to define this component as opposed to just a function is that we get a chance to set state.
Work with state.
We get a chance to define methods for the life cycle of the component. So that's something that you can only do if you're using classes or if you're using a new React feature called hooks, but we are not using those features. They are still like too new. If you go to the React documentation, they even say there is a, hooks new. So we are not using hooks. But yeah, if you use hooks, then you can have stateful functions. In any case, constructor, the state starts empty.
Yep.
Now we want to do something when the component mounts, and that is we want to start querying the server for data. So we have this component mount function that will be called by React when the component first mounts, and only then, only once. So when this happens, when
this is when you render it.
Yeah. So this is when I start querying the server for data. Okay. So I say like this, get data from server. I'm calling a function that doesn't exist. I'll define the function right now. Get data from server. In Java, you don't have to say the this dot every time. In JavaScript, I believe you're required to. You have to say this dot every time.
To mention that it is of the same thing.
Yeah, to be explicit and say I'm calling the get data from server from this object.
Yep.
Because in JavaScript, you could also have functions all over the place,
yeah.
So it could get confused. But in this case, we want to call this guy. Okay, so what do we do now? Well, we get the data from the server. We know how to do this. I can copy the code from here.
Yep.
So we get the data from the server.
And return this.
And this needs to be asynchronous, so I guess I can just say async. Perfect. And then we want to set a state, right? Now the state is no longer empty. The state is this whole thing. Could I say this.state equals that? No.
Why is that?
When you initialize the state in the constructor, you say this.state. Anytime you want to update a state afterwards, you have to use this setState.
Okay, function. It is like a lambda function here.
No. Yeah, because this is using the previous state. But there is another form of setState. That setState is, by the way, is coming from the React component thing, right?
Yeah.
So the setState, it could be a function if you had to access the previous state. But in this case, we don't have to, so we can just say this is the current state now. We can be explicit and just say that.
Yep.
Now, what is invalid number of arguments expected to? Really? I don't think so.
This set state.
Yeah, see, here is an example of set state being used with a direct state right there. Yep. So only one argument. So I believe this error message is just IntelliJ doesn't know about this. But in any case, what is happening is we are getting the data from the server, and then we loop, right?
Yep.
So we say
go through.
Window is something that comes with the browser.
Yeah.
And we say set timeout of 200 milliseconds. Call this dot get data from. Okay, that's exactly the same thing we had right here, right?
Yep.
Exactly the same thing we had here. So now, item list is a stateful component. When it mounts, it gets data from the server. Every 200 milliseconds, it gets data from the server again. And when it does, it updates the state.
Okay.
Now, this is the main reason why we are using React here, because React is super smart about how to do this. When we set the state to empty, it will render this.
The first time, okay. An empty.
In fact, we shouldn't be using these props items because now the items are being captured by the state. So we need to fix this. So we need to say this. I believe you just say this state. Yes, like so. This state, and then we have the items right there. So this state, because the state is a list.
The items,
The state is the item list. So now React is super smart. When we start by constructing the first time, constructing this or mounting this object, mounting this component the first time, it will know that this list is empty.
Yeah.
And then anytime we say this set state, it will update the state. And that's why it has to be a function, because React will, under the hood, do more things than just updating this variable. It will also call render again.
Okay.
With the updated state.
If it has been updated. If it has not been updated, it won't do anything.
And it will be smart enough to tell if it needs to change the
data values that we're seeing on the client.
Yeah, it will be smart to know if it needs to refresh the component or not. if the data from the server is the same as it was 200 milliseconds ago, it will not do anything. It will just check, is the key the same? Yeah, all right, so I won't even touch it. If the data from the server changes, then React will update only the parts that matter, only the parts that changed.
Only the items that have been modified.
And that's why we are using React here, because it's smart to do all this update conditionally on whether the data changed or not. So now to use this new stateful component,
change something here, right?
Yeah, we have to change a lot of things, because now the application doesn't pass in the items as props.
Yeah.
The items are being handled by the item list itself.
Yes.
Also, because the application is not passing them further down, we don't need to tell the application what the items are. But then because we are doing the whole get data from server from outside, we can mount the application only once and get rid of all of this. Now the application is being mounted only once, exactly what we wanted. And when the application mounts, it starts that item
list. The item list is empty at the start. Then React uses its item list class to query it every 200 milliseconds and sees if there's a change. If there's a change, it should refresh it on the client. Otherwise, it doesn't do anything. Does this mean we have a responsive application again?
I believe so, but let's see if this works.
Maybe not after all.
Yep.
So what is actually happening?
Items list state must be set to an object or null. Oh, interesting. I didn't know that about React. So either we have this state as null or as an object. It cannot be a list.
Empty. Okay.
So here we have to say items equals empty. When we use this state, we have to say items. And when we set this state, we have to say items. Refresh, retry, and if this works by the end of this episode, we only have like a few minutes left. I'll be so happy. Okay.
There's no errors.
No errors. And the application is responsive again.
Okay.
We fixed it. I'm super happy with this episode.
Yeah, actually. I didn't think this was going to happen here.
So we are not remounting the application every time. Now we have some more work to do.
Yeah, that we still have to do.
But we'll do that on the next one.
Yeah.
All right. I'm super happy with this. We fixed the application.
Definitely progress,
And we are using React more properly. And we have state now. And with props and state, you pretty much understand everything there is to understand about React.
And basic stuff that you should know about React.
And the life cycle of the component. That too. All right. This deserves a high five.
Yeah, it does.
All right. See you on the next one.